"You look hungry," Marcus whispered, holding out half his bologna sandwich. The Hell's Angel raised his head, tattoos crawling up a thick neck, bloodshot eyes softening at the skinny kid in duct-taped sneakers. The sandwich was the last food until his grandma's disability check cleared Friday. Across the street, knee-high weeds strangled a collapsed wheelchair ramp. The biker chewed slowly, then stared at the sagging porch. "She's stuck inside," the boy nodded. The engine roared off into the night. By sunrise, 500 bikes would return. Marcus was 11, his grandmother trapped on a rotting porch. He gave half his sandwich to a Hell's Angel named Tank. By sunrise, 500 bikers descended with lumber, soil, and tools. They worked in silence and vanished before she woke. This is how a hungry boy's kindness turned an outlaw gang into guardian angels. It began with Miss Clara's disability check being 13 days late. The house on Sycamore was a one-story lean that had been beautiful once, before arthritis bolted her to a wheelchair, before weeds climbed over the collapsed ramp, before the vegetable patch turned to dust because no one could bend down to water it. The porch sagged under the weight of quiet desperation. The only food in the fridge that Tuesday was a plastic-wrapped package of bologna, half a loaf of bread, and hope. Marcus was 11. He wore sneakers patched with silver tape, a jacket from the donation bin that still didn't fit, and the kind of heavy silence that comes from knowing the numbers don't add up. Every morning his grandmother pressed a foil-wrapped sandwich into his hands. The same sandwich. The last sandwich. And every morning he'd eat it slowly, so the hunger wouldn't notice until supper. That afternoon, he sat on the porch splintering the armrest with his thumbnail when he saw the man across the street. A massive biker slumped against the chain-link fence like a wrecked machine. Leather vest black with road dirt, head bowed, not moving. For an hour the man didn't shift. The neighborhood didn't notice. This was the kind of block where people pulled curtains, not questions. But Marcus saw the exhaustion. He saw it because he recognized it. So he crossed the cracked asphalt with the foil package still warm in his pocket. Up close, the man smelled of rain and gasoline. Tattoos crawled up his neck over his knuckles, a skull with wings on the patch. His eyes were bloodshot and unfocused. "You look hungry," Marcus said, tearing the sandwich in two. The biker, call sign Tank, raised his head. For a long moment he just stared at the skinny kid with the too short sleeves. Then he took the half sandwich without a word and ate it slowly, eyes closed, like it was the first kindness he'd been offered in 1,000 miles. When he was done, Tank looked past the boy. He saw the yard, knee-high weeds, a wheelchair ramp splintered in two, a garden choked by neglect. He saw the windows with cardboard taped where glass should be. He saw the old woman's silhouette behind the screen door, hands knotted with pain. "She stuck inside?" Tank asked. Marcus nodded. "Can't get her chair down the steps no more." Tank didn't say anything else. He stood, knees cracking, swung a massive leg over the bike and kicked the engine alive. Marcus watched the red taillight disappear into the evening haze and felt the familiar hollow of a goodbye that meant nothing. He went inside, told his grandma he'd finished his sandwich, and sat in the dark. What Marcus didn't know is that Tank was a regional sergeant-at-arms with a network that stretched across 3 states. What Tank had seen in that yard wasn't just weeds. It was a code red for a brotherhood that operated on a single iron rule. A favor given is a debt carved in bone. Somewhere between the county line and the interstate, he pulled over and made one phone call. Just before dawn, a low vibration rattled the window frame. Marcus crept to the glass and saw headlights flooding the street, motorcycles, flatbeds, pickup trucks. The rumble grew until the walls hummed. The boy's eyes went wide. 500 bikers in leather cuts poured onto the property, carrying lumber, soil, saplings, and tools. They moved in disciplined silence, as if the whole operation had been rehearsed in a single night. Miss Clara woke to the sound of nothing. For a woman who'd spent 13 years listening for the creak of a ramp she no longer had, silence was a kind of noise. She pulled herself upright, wincing, and wheeled toward the window. Through the dawn haze, shapes were moving. At first, her mind rounded them into something familiar, garbage men, maybe the city finally clearing the blocked drain. But the shapes were too many, too quiet, moving with a unified purpose that felt almost military. Then she saw the leather vests. Her hand flew to her mouth. 100 men, then 200, then more than she could count, were kneeling in her backyard. Not in prayer. They were laying pavers. One man, white-bearded and built like a refrigerator, gently lifted a wilted tomato vine on a stake and set it aside, as if handling a wounded bird. Another measured the collapsed ramp with a laser, and two others were already behind him with fresh lumber. No shouting, no orders, just a quiet, rolling hum of industry. Marcus stood on the porch barefoot, clutching the screen door handle, heart thumping in his throat. He'd never seen so many motorcycles. They lined the street, a mechanical herd, chrome glinting in the early sun. A few women in leather cuts were hauling bags of soil. One of them, a tall woman with a silver braid, caught his eye and winked. "Your grandma like tulips, baby," she called, not waiting for an answer, already pulling bulbs from a bag. Tank was at the center of it all, his massive frame directing like a conductor. He changed out of his road-filthy vest into a clean one, same patch, but his arms were bare now, showing the full canvas of ink. Marcus watched him lift a 50-pound bag of mulch with one arm as if it were a pillow. The boy's chest tightened with something he didn't have a name for. He'd given away half a sandwich. He was hungry that day. The math didn't add up. What Marcus didn't know that morning was the thing Tank had said to his brothers in the diner parking lot hours before. "That kid's got nothing. His grandma's trapped. He split his last meal with me. I'm not leaving that block until it looks like a place he can be proud to come home to." That was the signal. That was the only order. By 6 a.m., the collapsed ramp was gone. In its place, a curved wooden structure rose smoothly toward the back door, precisely graded, handrails polished. A crew of 4 bikers, one of whom was a retired ironworker, another a structural engineer who'd fallen from grace, had it framed and decked in under 2 hours. They tested it by running a wheelchair up and down half a dozen times, adjusting the angle with spirit levels until it rolled as easily as a stroller on marble. In the garden, the transformation was botanical surgery. A man called Doc. He'd done 2 tours in Vietnam as a medic and then spent 30 years as a landscaper in Arizona, was on his knees teaching 3 younger bikers how to lay irrigation lines. They'd brought raised bed kits pre-made, soil already mixed with compost from a farm 2 counties over. A girl about 17, Tank's daughter maybe, was gently transplanting the old tomato vines into new soil, whispering to them. The whole thing was a quiet resurrection. Clara, still in her nightgown, wheeled to the back door. Tank saw her. He set down a sawhorse and walked over. For a moment they just stared at each other. He, 6'4", with a tattoo of a tear under his eye, she wasn't sure whether it was a memorial or a warning. She, 73, a black woman who'd seen more broken promises than this man, had ridden miles. "Ma'am," he said, voice like gravel but softer than you'd think. "We're gonna need you to stay inside for a few hours. It's gonna get dusty. Then you come out and see." She opened her mouth. No sound came. She touched his arm with gnarled fingers. He flinched, not from pain, but from the same thing that made grown men cry in the lot when no one was looking. But the story doesn't end there. The transformation of one backyard would soon ripple through the whole neighborhood. Something had been set in motion that no one could have predicted. Because by the time the sun hit noon that day, a woman 2 streets over was standing in her own overgrown yard, watching the bikers from her fence, making a decision that would change her life. And that decision would pull Marcus into a world far bigger than a garden. The woman's name was Estelle Withers, and she'd lived on that block for 42 years. Her husband had died on the same couch where she now sat every evening watching game shows, and her children had scattered to cities that never called. The weeds in her yard were a kind of armor, keeping out a world that had stopped noticing her a decade ago. But that morning, she saw the bikers and she saw the transformation next door, and something cracked. She hobbled to her front gate, still in her slippers, and stood watching until one of the bikers, a wiry man with a gray ponytail and a patch that read Chaplain, noticed her. He walked over, wiping dirt from his hands. "Ma'am, you okay?" Estelle pointed a shaking finger at Clara's house. "Who are you people?" The chaplain smiled, the kind of smile that had seen 1,000 confessions. "We're just some folks repaying a sandwich, ma'am." Estelle didn't understand, but she felt the crack widen. She looked at her own yard, the dead hedge, the step her husband had promised to fix in 1991. "Could you?" She couldn't finish. The chaplain nodded. "We finish Miss Clara's place by noon. We'll swing by." That was how it started. By the time Clara's garden was blooming, 3 other houses on the block had bikers in their yards. A retired postal worker got his porch repainted. A single mother of 2 had her broken fence replaced. The bikers didn't ask for money. They didn't ask for anything. And the neighborhood, which had been a place where curtains stayed drawn and trust was rationed, started to stir. People came out onto their porches. They brought glasses of sweet tea. They watched men they'd been told to fear fixing steps and planting roses, and something ancient and stubborn in the air began to shift. But Estelle Withers had a nephew. His name was Dwight, and he worked for the county. When he heard that a group of biker types had taken over his aunt's block, he made a call. By midday, a county code enforcement truck pulled up. A man in a polo shirt stepped out with a clipboard and a permanent scowl. He walked past the new ramp, past the raised beds, and knocked on Clara's door. "Ma'am, you got permits for this structure." Clara's hand trembled on the door frame. She hadn't set foot outside in 2 years, and now a stranger was asking for paperwork. Tank appeared before she could answer. He moved with the slow, deliberate weight of a man who had been threatened by smaller men his whole life and had never lost a fight. "The ramp is to code. We measured it twice." The inspector, whose name was Gary, didn't flinch. "Code doesn't matter if you don't have a permit. I'm gonna have to ask you to stop work." The whole block went quiet. Hammers paused. The bikers turned, 100 faces hardened by sun and asphalt, and Gary suddenly felt very alone. Marcus had been watching from the porch. He didn't understand permits, but he understood power. He saw the way Gary's hand shook slightly as he held the clipboard. He saw the way Tank didn't raise his voice. Tank just unzipped a pocket on his vest and pulled out a folded envelope. Inside were the original building permits for Miss Clara's house from 1962, before the ramp had collapsed, before the wheelchair, before decades of neglect. And clipped to them was a fresh permit, stamped and dated that very morning with an addendum for accessibility retrofitting, signed by the county supervisor himself. Tank handed it over. "Got it at 6 a.m., he said. "Your boss likes bikes." Gary's face went pale. He muttered something about checks and left. The bikers resumed work, but the encounter had consequences. Dwight, undeterred, called the local news. He framed it as a gang takeover, a public safety threat. By early afternoon, a news van pulled up, and a reporter with perfect hair started filming. The footage that aired at 5 o'clock that evening would change everything, but not in the way Dwight expected. The reporter, a woman named Elise who had spent years covering corruption and was bone tired of it, found Clara sitting in her new garden, weaving a basket of tulips. "Why are all these bikers here?" she asked. Clara, her voice steady for the first time in years, said, "Because my grandson fed a man when we didn't have enough for ourselves. That man came back with an army of angels who don't look like angels." She gestured at Tank, who was now planting a pear tree. "That one, he's an angel." Tank grunted, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm a mechanic, ma'am," Clara chuckled. "Same thing with cleaner hands." Elise's camera operator captured a moment that no one could script. A small boy, duct-taped sneakers, a too small jacket, standing beside a giant with neck tattoos, both of them holding a sapling together. Marcus's hand was so small it disappeared in Tank's. The image hit the evening news like a thunderclap. But the story wasn't just about a garden anymore. That night the phone at Miss Clara's house rang. It was the principal of Marcus's school. Someone had seen the news and wanted to remain anonymous. A full scholarship had been set up for Marcus, all the way through college, funded by a collective of motorcycle clubs across 3 states. The principal was crying as she told Clara. Clara dropped the phone. Marcus picked it up just in time to hear, "Marcus, you're going to be an engineer or a doctor or whatever you want." The boy, who had spent the last 3 years counting change and skipping lunch, stared at the receiver like it had fallen from another planet. Tank was sitting on the porch, drinking a soda. He saw the look on Marcus's face and set the can down. "What's wrong?" Marcus couldn't speak. He just handed Tank the phone. Tank listened, said "uh-huh" twice, and then hung up. He looked at the boy. "Looks like you're going to college, kid." And then the toughest biker on the eastern seaboard cried for the second time in 2 days. But even that wasn't the full dimension of what had been set in motion. because the club's leadership, watching the footage from 1,000 miles away, had made a decision. They'd been looking for a way to channel their resources into something lasting, something that honored the code without the baggage. And they'd found it. A child, a sandwich, a garden. It was the kind of narrative that could rebuild the club's soul. And it began in earnest the next morning, when 50 more bikers arrived not with shovels, but with legal documents, blueprints, and a plan for a national foundation that would turn every biker's debt of honor into a concrete, permanent gift. Marcus had no idea that his act of feeding a stranger was about to become the genesis of an entirely new kind of brotherhood. 3 weeks after the bikers left, Miss Clara wheeled herself down the new ramp for the first time in 2 years. The morning sun caught the hand-painted sign Tank had nailed to the fence. Miss Clara's garden. She traced the letters with a swollen finger, then looked out at the raised beds bursting with kale and tomatoes, the pear sapling, the brick pathway that curved around a wooden bench. She didn't cry, not then. She just sat there breathing in the smell of turned earth and fresh lumber and whispered, "Thank you, baby," to a boy who was still asleep inside. But the garden was only the beginning. That news broadcast, the one Dwight had expected to demonize a gang, had done the opposite. Elise's segment ran nationally. Within 48 hours, the station's website crashed from traffic. A GoFundMe page appeared, set up by a grandmother in Seattle who said she'd been that boy once. It raised over $60,000 by the weekend, all of it redirected to a trust Clara's lawyer drafted from her hospital bed. The trust wasn't for Marcus alone. It was for any kid on Sycamore Street who needed a ramp, a meal, a way out, and the bikers, they didn't disappear. The following Saturday, Tank rode back alone. No flatbeds, no crews, just a man with a leather vest and a framed photograph. He found Marcus on the porch and handed it to him. It was the foil wrapper from the bologna sandwich, pressed flat beneath glass, and beside it a handwritten inscription: "The dearest meal I ever ate. D. Tank Morrison, Hell's Angel, redeemed August 2019. Marcus turned the frame over. On the back, in block letters, "Repaid in full. Now you owe us nothing. Pass it on." The boy hugged the frame to his chest and didn't let go for a long time. That frame now hangs in the clubhouse of the Angels, regional headquarters outside Dayton. Beside it, a bronze plaque details the Half Sandwich Initiative, a program that has since dispatched over 700 bikers to 83 towns across 12 states, rebuilding wheelchair ramps, community gardens, and school libraries, all funded by the club's own poker runs and patch sales. The initiative's charter has one rule: you never ask for payment. You accept a glass of water if offered, and you remember that you were once the stranger at the gate. For Marcus, the scholarship wasn't a single check. It was a promise that stretched from middle school through a mechanical engineering degree at Ohio State. He spent summers interning at a custom bike shop Tank's cousin owned, learning to weld and mill, and listen to an engine the way his grandfather used to listen to the radio, with one ear tilted and a hand on the manifold. On his first day of high school, he walked in wearing new sneakers and a jacket that fit, but the duct tape never quite left his memory. He kept a roll in his locker. Clara, against every medical expectation, began to walk again. Not far, not without a cane, but enough to tend her tomatoes. Enough to stand at the fence and talk to Estelle, whose nephew Dwight had been quietly transferred to a desk job in a different county. Estelle's yard, by that point, boasted a rose trellis and a bird bath courtesy of the chaplain's crew. On summer evenings, the two women would sit on Clara's bench with glasses of iced tea and watch the pear tree grow. Neither had to explain. The garden said everything. The ripple didn't stop at the block. A documentary filmmaker, a former biker herself, heard the story and spent 6 months filming. That film, Half a Sandwich, premiered at a festival in Austin and won an audience award. It ended with footage of Tank and Marcus, 5 years later, standing side by side at a college commencement. Tank is in a suit jacket over his cut, and Marcus is in a cap and gown, holding a diploma in one hand and a wrapped sandwich in the other. The audience laughed. They cried. They understood that the miracle wasn't the garden, wasn't the scholarship, wasn't even the hundreds of bikers who descended like a tide. The miracle was the choice of a skinny 11-year-old who saw a man at the end of his rope and didn't look away. And that brings me to the thing that still haunts me about this whole story. It's not the scale. It's not the redemption. It's the way we teach children to fear strangers, to lock the door when someone with tattoos knocks. But Marcus, who had every reason to be afraid, who had less to give than anyone on that block, he did the one thing that 500 bikers couldn't do by themselves. He took the first step. He broke the chain. So I have to ask myself, would I have crossed that street? Would I have offered my last sandwich to a man whose very outline on a dark road would have made me lock the car door? I'd like to say yes. But the truth is, most of us have been taught to see the vest before the person. Marcus saw a hungry stranger. He didn't see a probation record or a club patch or 1,000 news stories about what those kinds of men can do. He saw exhaustion. And that single, unguarded act of recognition pulled an entire army out of the asphalt. Tank once said in an interview that he'd spent 20 years building a reputation that scared people, and 7 minutes with a boy in duct-tape sneakers dismantled it completely. That's the part that sticks with me. Not the garden, not the scholarships, but the idea that a child's kindness can undo 2 decades of armor, that the world doesn't always work in the direction of fear. So here's my question for you, and I want the honest answer, not the one that makes you look good. When that knock comes 9 at night, rain hammering, a silhouette at the door that triggers every alarm in your brain, do you open it? Are you the 6th door that stays shut, or are you the 7th? Tell me in the comments. And if this story moved you, drop a heart below and subscribe so the next one finds you. Share it with someone who's forgotten that redemption doesn't always wear a clean shirt. Because somewhere on a roadside tonight, someone's still pushing a dead bike. Be the one who opens the door.